There's a stretch of water off the southern coast of Iran that is only 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point. You could swim across it in an afternoon if the currents weren't lethal and the waters weren't patrolled by warships. And through that 33-kilometer gap passes roughly 1/5 of everything the entire planet burns for fuel every single day. Not 1/5 of America's oil, not 1/5 of the Gulf's oil, 1/5 of global consumption. Around 20 million barrels every 24 hours, funneled through a channel narrow enough that a single sunk tanker could block it completely. On the morning of July 11th, 2026, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps did something it has now done more than once in this war. It fired on a civilian vessel, and then it announced in a statement carried by its own state media that the Strait of Hormuz was closed. Not slowed, not restricted. Closed, in the IRGC's own words, until further notice. But here's the part almost nobody is talking about correctly. The story people think they know, another round of American airstrikes, another cycle of tit for tat, is not actually what happened next. What the United States did in the 72 hours following that closure was not simply more bombing. It was something structurally different from everything that came before it in this war. And by the end of this video, you are going to understand exactly why defense analysts and energy markets traders are describing the American response as the first real signal of how this entire conflict might actually end. Stay with me. We are going to go through this properly, from the ship that got hit, to the targets that got struck, to the financial network most people watching this war have never even heard of, to the single social media post from the President of the United States that quietly reversed a policy nobody expected him to reverse. All of it matters. All of it connects. Let's get into it. Before we go further, a quick note on how I approach these breakdowns. I spend my time tracking naval flashpoints, energy choke points, and the financial plumbing behind modern conflicts, because that is usually where the real story is hiding, not in the explosions, but in the shipping manifests, the sanctions filings, and the fee schedules nobody reads. I am not going to hand you speculation dressed up as certainty. Where something is confirmed by the Pentagon or CENTCOM, I will say so. Where something is still developing or contested, I will say that too. My goal in every one of these videos is the same: give you the layered version of the story that a 15-second news clip cannot possibly deliver. Let's start with why this waterway breaks the entire global economy every time somebody threatens to close it. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran on one side and Oman and the United Arab Emirates on the other, connecting the Persian Gulf to the Gulf of Oman, and from there to the open ocean. Every major oil producer in the Gulf, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, and Iraq, ships the overwhelming majority of its crude and liquefied natural gas exports through this single channel. There is no alternate route that comes close to matching its capacity. Pipelines exist that bypass it, but they cover only a fraction of what the strait carries by sea. When the strait slows down, oil markets do not shrug it off. They react immediately, because traders know that a genuine closure would remove a chunk of global supply that cannot be replaced overnight from anywhere else on Earth. This is not the first time in this war that Iran has threatened or attempted to close the strait, and understanding that pattern is essential to understanding what happened on July 11th. This conflict began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched a coordinated set of strikes against Iranian targets, an operation that also resulted in the deaths of Iran's supreme leader and a number of senior Iranian officials. Iran's response was immediate. It moved to block the Strait of Hormuz, and the United States, in turn, launched what became known as the Strait of Hormuz campaign, a sustained air operation aimed specifically at destroying the Iranian naval assets, drone units, and coastal missile systems capable of threatening commercial shipping in the strait. That campaign has run, with pauses and restarts, for months. In March, U.S. forces destroyed more than a dozen Iranian mine-laying vessels operating near the strait, a direct response to concerns that Iran intended to seed the channel with naval mines, a much slower, quieter, and in some ways more dangerous method of closing a waterway than missile strikes, because mines do not care whether a tanker is Iranian, American, Chinese, or Panamanian flagged. A mine sits in the channel until something detonates it. Around the same period, satellite imagery showed fires burning at Iran's main naval headquarters in Bandar Abbas, the port city that sits almost directly on the strait, and functions as the operational heart of Iran's naval presence in the Gulf. By April 13th, the United States had gone a step further, imposing a full naval blockade on Iranian ports themselves, a response to the collapse of a round of diplomatic talks held in Islamabad during a brief ceasefire window. Israel, separately, assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the IRGC naval commander who had publicly overseen much of Iran's blockade and mining strategy in the strait, removing one of the most experienced maritime commanders Iran had in this fight. Through the spring, the pattern repeated itself in cycles. Iran would threaten or attempt to restrict the strait, the U.S. would strike the assets enabling that threat, a temporary calm would follow, and then something would break it again. It also helps to understand why Iran believes it has leverage over this waterway at all, beyond simple geography. At the western mouth of the strait sit a handful of small islands, Greater Tum, Lesser Tum, and Abu Musa among them, that Iran has controlled since 1971, when Iranian forces seized them just before the founding of the United Arab Emirates, which has disputed Iranian control of the islands ever since at Gulf Cooperation Council summits and Arab League meetings. Iran has spent decades since then building coastal defense systems, radar coverage, and missile positions on and around these islands, specifically because of their position at the strait's narrowest approach. This is the same geography and the same infrastructure that has been targeted repeatedly throughout the current war, because it forms the backbone of Iran's ability to observe and threaten shipping lanes in the first place. Layered on top of that fixed infrastructure is Iran's naval doctrine itself, which is not built around winning a conventional battle against the U.S. Navy. It is built around asymmetric harassment using large numbers of small, fast attack boats, sometimes referred to as Iran's mosquito fleet, capable of swarming a single tanker from multiple directions, alongside naval mines and coastal missile fire. Iran does not need to sink a supertanker to achieve its objective. It only needs commercial shipping companies and their insurers to conclude that the risk of transiting the strait has become unacceptable. If insurance premiums spike high enough, ships simply stop coming, and the strait is effectively closed without Iran winning a single direct engagement. That doctrine is exactly why the American campaign has consistently targeted not just weapons and boats, but the surveillance and command networks that let Iran coordinate a swarm attack in the first place, because removing the ability to see and coordinate degrades the doctrine far more effectively than removing individual boats one at a time. Which brings us to July 11th, and the ship that restarted everything. The vessel at the center of this latest escalation was a Cyprus-flagged container ship called the GFS Galaxy. According to U.S. Central Command, IRGC forces struck the Galaxy while it was transiting the strait, an attack that left one crew member missing and caused what CENTCOM described as significant damage to the ship's engine room. Iran's justification, relayed through its own state and semi-official media, was that the Galaxy had been using what the IRGC called an unauthorized route through the waterway, language that effectively means Iran is claiming the right to dictate exactly which lanes of an international strait commercial vessels are permitted to use, and to enforce that claim with live fire. CENTCOM's public response framed the strike bluntly. Iran, in the U.S. military's own words, had already been given a chance to demonstrate compliance with an existing memorandum of understanding after previous attacks on commercial vessels, and had again failed to do so. Within hours, the IRGC's naval arm announced the strait's closure, and Iranian diplomats were simultaneously meeting with their Omani counterparts to discuss a proposal reportedly drafted by Oman, aimed at managing safe traffic through the waterway going forward. That diplomatic track and the military escalation were unfolding at the exact same time, which is worth sitting with for a moment. Even as Iran was closing the strait by force, its foreign ministry was in the room, with a neutral mediator trying to negotiate the terms under which it might reopen. That contradiction, aggression, and negotiation running in parallel has been a defining feature of Iran's behavior throughout this entire war, and it shows up again later in this story in a much bigger way. The United States did not wait. CENTCOM confirmed that over the following 3 nights, American forces conducted a sustained strike campaign against Iranian military infrastructure directly tied to the strait, and by the 3rd night, the cumulative total had passed 300 targets struck at the direct order of the commander-in-chief, aimed squarely at degrading Iran's ability to threaten civilian mariners and commercial vessels moving through the waterway. Let's break down what those 300 targets actually were, because the category list CENTCOM released tells you exactly what kind of campaign this is. The strikes hit Iranian missile and drone sites, the launch systems and storage facilities capable of hitting ships from shore. They hit naval capabilities, the patrol boats, fast attack craft, and support vessels that Iran uses to physically intercept or harass shipping. They hit ammunition storage facilities, removing the physical stockpiles that feed every other weapon system on this list. They hit communication networks, the command and control infrastructure that lets Iranian units coordinate an attack in the first place. And they hit coastal surveillance locations, the radar and sensor installations that let Iran actually see which ships are transiting the strait and where. If you go back and watch how this campaign has unfolded since February, this is the same doctrine repeating itself at a larger scale. You cannot stop a naval harassment campaign by only hitting boats, because Iran can build or reposition boats. You have to blind the network that tells those boats where to go, and you have to remove the ability to resupply them once their stockpiles run low. The 3rd night's strike total, more than 300 targets in 72 hours, represents one of the most intensive and broadly distributed strike campaigns of the entire war to date, hitting Iran's ability to threaten the strait at almost every layer simultaneously. The eyes, the weapons, the ammunition, and the communications tying it all together. And on the ground, or rather on the water, that intensity has been visible for months. U.S. Navy warships and aircraft have maintained a continuous presence transiting near the strait throughout this campaign, a visible signal to every shipping company and every insurer watching this conflict that the United States intends to keep this route contested rather than cede it. It's worth pausing here to appreciate just how much operational coordination a strike tempo like this actually requires. Hitting more than 300 targets across 3 nights is not a single squadron flying a single mission profile. It means synchronized timing between Air Force and Navy strike aircraft, real-time intelligence updates feeding target lists as Iranian units attempt to disperse or reposition once the first wave lands, and enough munitions pre-positioned in the region to sustain that tempo, night after night without a pause for resupply. Every previous phase of this campaign, going back to the mine-laying vessel strikes in March, has effectively been rehearsal for exactly this kind of sustained, multi-night operation. What we watched happen in the days after July 11th was the accumulated experience of the entire war being applied at a larger scale, all at once. It's also worth noting who is actually running this campaign. U.S. Central Command, currently under the command of Admiral Brad Cooper, has effective operational responsibility for coordinating this entire theater, from strike planning to the naval blockade to the continuous presence patrols in and around the strait itself. Every public CENTCOM statement referenced throughout this campaign, the target category breakdowns, the strike totals, the description of the GFS Galaxy incident, comes out of that same command structure, working in direct coordination with Secretary of War Pete Hegseth and Chairman of the Joint Chiefs General Dan Kane. Understanding that this is one integrated command running the military, blockade, and presence patrol pieces together, rather than 3 separate uncoordinated efforts, matters enormously for understanding why the economic and diplomatic pieces we're about to get into landed in the same 72-hour window rather than weeks apart. If this breakdown is giving you the layered version of this story, the one connecting the military strikes to what happens next, hit subscribe and turn on notifications now, because the next section is the actual point of this entire video, and it is the part almost no other channel covering this war is explaining correctly. Here's where the story stops being a simple military exchange and becomes something far more interesting. While CENTCOM's strikes were still underway, the U.S. Treasury Department announced a separate and, on the surface, much quieter action. It was intensifying efforts to disrupt and degrade a shipping and sanctions evasion network tied to a man named Mohammad Hossein Shamkhani. Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent described this network directly as one of the Iranian regime's most profitable engines, and framed the action as part of an ongoing campaign to increase economic pressure on Tehran in direct response to the resumption of attacks in the strait. Think about what that means operationally. While American aircraft and ships were degrading Iran's physical ability to threaten the strait, the Treasury Department was simultaneously going after the financial infrastructure that allows Iran to move sanctioned oil around the world in the first place. The shadow fleet of tankers, the shell companies, the intermediaries that let Iranian crude reach buyers despite years of sanctions. This is not redundant with the military campaign. It is a second front, running in parallel, aimed at a completely different layer of Iranian capability. Not the ability to threaten ships in the strait, but the ability to profit from oil exports at all, sanctioned or otherwise. This is the piece of the story that gets buried under strike counts and target lists, because it does not produce dramatic footage. There is no explosion to show you. But if you are trying to understand how the United States is actually trying to end this conflict rather than just punish Iran for the latest provocation, this is arguably more important than any single night of airstrikes. Degrading Iran's naval capability buys time and reduces immediate risk to shipping. Degrading Iran's sanctions-evasion financial network is aimed at the actual economic incentive structure that makes this entire confrontation worth it to Tehran in the first place. Now here's the part that genuinely surprised a lot of people who follow this conflict closely, including people who were certain they knew exactly how the Trump administration would respond to Iran closing the strait again. Earlier in the campaign, the administration had floated the idea of imposing a fee, reportedly around 20%, on cargo moving through the Strait of Hormuz, a punitive economic measure aimed at the shipping traffic exposed to the conflict. On July 14th, President Trump announced he was walking that fee back entirely. In its place, according to the president's own statement, the administration would instead pursue what he described as trade and investment deals with the various Gulf states. Sit with that for a second, because the sequencing matters enormously. In the same week that the United States hit more than 300 Iranian military targets, and Treasury was simultaneously dismantling a sanctions evasion network, the president was publicly pivoting away from a punitive economic measure aimed at the broader shipping industry and toward a framework of trade and investment partnerships with Gulf governments. That is not the behavior of an administration trying to maximize economic pain on everyone touching this waterway. It is the behavior of an administration trying to separate its adversary, Iran specifically, from its partners, the Gulf states whose economies also depend on that same strait staying open, and whose cooperation the U.S. clearly still wants. President Trump's own public messaging around this reinforced that read directly. He credited what he called the awesome power of the United States military for oil now flowing, in his words, like never before. And he specifically thanked Secretary of War Pete Hegseth, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane, and the Commander of U.S. Central Command, Admiral Brad Cooper, by name in the same post where he announced the reversal on the transit fee. That is, a president explicitly linking military success in the Strait to a diplomatic and economic outreach decision, in the same breath, on the same platform, within days of the largest strike wave of this stage of the war. This is the message nobody expected that the title of this video is pointing to. Most people watching this conflict expected escalation to mean more strikes, more targets, more punitive economic measures aimed broadly at anyone connected to the region. What actually happened was a strike campaign paired with a financial network takedown paired with an olive branch to the very same Gulf economies that depend on this strait, all delivered within the same 72-hour window. That is not chaos. That is a coordinated multi-domain message. Maximum pressure on Iran specifically, and an open hand to everyone else standing near it. It would be a mistake to think the only two audiences for this sequence are Tehran and the Gulf states. Every major power with an interest in global energy markets and in how the United States handles asymmetric maritime threats is studying this exact playbook right now, because the Strait of Hormuz is not the only choke point in the world where a state actor could try this same strategy. China, which imports a substantial share of its crude oil through this same waterway, has every incentive to want this conflict resolved quickly and predictably, and is almost certainly watching how effectively the combination of military pressure, financial network disruption, and diplomatic outreach actually stabilizes shipping costs and insurance rates. Russia, which has spent years building its own sanctions-evasion shipping networks to move oil despite its own restrictions, is watching the Treasury action against the Shamkhani network specifically, because the techniques used to identify and disrupt that network, tracking shell companies, shadow fleet vessels, and intermediary buyers, are broadly transferable to any sanctioned oil exporter, not just Iran. And Gulf producers themselves, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, and Kuwait, are watching to see whether Washington's pivot toward trade and investment deals is a durable commitment or a short-term gesture tied to this particular news cycle. That last audience may matter more than any other in the long run. Every one of those Gulf economies has its own direct financial exposure to a closed or contested strait, and every one of them has, at various points during this broader conflict, engaged in its own separate diplomatic contact with Tehran, hedging against the possibility that Washington's approach either escalates too far or doesn't hold. A credible, sustained trade and investment relationship with the United States gives those governments less incentive to hedge in that direction. A fee that punishes their own shipping industry alongside Iran's does the opposite. That is almost certainly why the timing of the fee reversal, landing in the same week as the largest strike wave in the Treasury action, reads less like a coincidence and more like a deliberate attempt to keep every regional partner pointed in the same direction, while the pressure on Iran specifically intensifies. Let's pull back and look at the full shape of this campaign since February, because that is the only way to properly evaluate whether this latest sequence actually represents something new or is simply more of the same dressed up differently. From the war's opening days, the pattern has been consistent. Iran threatens or attempts to close the strait. The United States responds militarily against the specific capability enabling that threat, and after a period of pressure, some kind of negotiation track opens, usually mediated by a third party like Oman, only for it to collapse and restart the cycle. We saw this in February and March with the initial closure in the mine-laying vessel campaign. We saw it again in April with the Islamabad talks collapsing and the naval blockade being imposed in response. We are seeing a version of it again now, with Omani mediation running in parallel with the July 11th closure and strikes. What is different this time is the addition of a clearly financial and diplomatic layer running simultaneously with the military one, rather than sequentially after it. Earlier phases of this war look, in hindsight, like the U.S. was primarily trying to solve an immediate physical threat. Stop the mines, stop the boats, stop the missile sites. This latest phase looks like the United States is trying to solve a structural problem. Remove Iran's ability to profit from evading sanctions in the first place, while simultaneously reassuring the Gulf states that their economic relationship with Washington is not going to be collateral damage in a fight with Tehran. If that reading is correct, and the Treasury action against the Shamkhani network combined with the fee reversal both support it, then the strategic goal here is not simply to reopen the strait for another few weeks until the next incident. It is to change Iran's calculation about whether continuing this pattern of closures is even worth it economically, while making sure Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Qatar have every incentive to stay aligned with Washington rather than pushing for their own separate accommodation with Tehran out of pure economic self-interest. Whether that strategy actually works is the open question. Iran has absorbed months of strikes on its naval and coastal infrastructure and has repeatedly rebuilt or repositioned enough capability to threaten the strait again within weeks each time. The IRGC's naval doctrine throughout this war has never depended on winning a conventional engagement with the U.S. Navy. It depends on making the strait feel unsafe enough, often enough, that shipping companies and insurers treat the risk as unacceptable, regardless of how many individual strikes the U.S. carries out. Degrading that doctrine requires more than removing hardware. It requires removing the economic logic that makes harassment worthwhile in the first place, which is exactly what the sanctions network action is aimed at, and exactly why I think it deserves far more attention than it has gotten in most coverage of this week's events. This is also why every past ceasefire in this war has proven fragile rather than final. A ceasefire that only pauses the military exchange without addressing either the physical infrastructure enabling harassment or the financial network funding it leaves both sides with every incentive to resume the exact same behavior once the political pressure to maintain calm fades. The Islamabad talks collapse in April is the clearest example of this pattern. A diplomatic track opened, ran for a period, and then broke down, followed almost immediately by a return to blockade and strikes. If the current sequence, military pressure, financial network disruption, and Gulf state trade outreach, is genuinely different from what came before, it should show up as a ceasefire or de-escalation period that actually holds longer than the previous ones, because the underlying incentives on both sides have shifted rather than merely paused. There is also a resource and attrition dimension to this that rarely gets discussed. Every strike campaign of this scale draws down precision munitions inventories, requires sustained forward basing and logistics support across the region, and ties down naval and air assets that could otherwise be postured elsewhere. Sustaining a rolling multi-month campaign like this one is not free for the United States either, even setting aside the question of whether it is working. That is part of why pairing the military track with a financial and diplomatic track matters so much strategically. If sanctions pressure and Gulf state alignment can do some of the work that would otherwise require additional strike waves, it reduces the operational burden on the military campaign itself and makes the overall approach more sustainable over the kind of multi-month or multi-year timeline that asymmetric conflicts like this one tend to run on. Now let's bring this down to ground level, because everything we have just walked through has consequences that reach far beyond the Gulf and far beyond this specific week of the war. Roughly 20 million barrels of oil move through the Strait of Hormuz every single day under normal conditions, representing close to a fifth of everything the world consumes. Alongside that oil, a substantial share of the world's liquefied natural gas exports also transits this same channel. When the strait closes, even briefly, or when shipping firms suspend operations there out of caution, as they did earlier in this war following IRGC warnings and attacks, the effect on global energy prices is immediate. Insurance premiums for any vessel willing to attempt the transit spike sharply. Some shipping firms simply refuse to send vessels through at all until the risk assessment changes, which is precisely what happened during earlier closures this year. The economies most immediately exposed are the Gulf producers themselves. Iraq and Kuwait, in particular, rely on this narrow passage as essentially their only viable route to export the oil that funds their national budgets. A prolonged disruption does not just raise prices at gas stations in the United States or Europe. It threatens the fiscal stability of governments that depend almost entirely on oil revenue moving through this one channel. Beyond the Gulf, major energy importers across Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and India, depend heavily on crude sourced from this region, meaning a serious and sustained closure would ripple through supply chains and cost of living pressures on nearly every continent for people who will never see a headline mentioning the Strait of Hormuz by name. This is why the Treasury action against Iran's sanctions-evasion network and the diplomatic pivot toward Gulf trade deals matter just as much as the strike numbers. A purely military solution to this conflict, more strikes, more targets, repeated indefinitely, does not actually stabilize the economic uncertainty driving up costs for shipping companies and insurers around the world. What stabilizes that uncertainty is a credible signal that the underlying incentive for closing the strait, whether military harassment or financial gain from evading sanctions, is being dismantled at a structural level, alongside reassurance to the economies most exposed that their relationship with Washington will not be sacrificed in the process. There is a useful historical parallel here, and it is one that maritime insurers know well, even if most viewers have never heard of it. During the so-called tanker war of the 1980s, both Iran and Iraq attacked commercial shipping in the Gulf for years without ever fully closing the strait to traffic, because neither side needed to sink every ship attempting the transit. They needed insurers to price the risk high enough that the economics of shipping through the Gulf became painful. That earlier conflict is the direct doctrinal ancestor of the harassment strategy Iran has used throughout this current war, and it is exactly why modern responses to it cannot be purely kinetic. Insurers today rely on real-time risk assessments from maritime intelligence firms that track every incident, every closure announcement, and every diplomatic development in the region, and they adjust premiums accordingly, sometimes within hours of a single incident like the GFS Galaxy attack. A prolonged elevated risk premium on Gulf shipping raises the delivered cost of oil and gas for importers everywhere. Regardless of whether a single additional barrel is physically prevented from moving, that cost shows up in places that have nothing to do with military strategy. It shows up in the price of jet fuel for airlines operating flights that never come anywhere near the Gulf. It shows up in fertilizer prices, since natural gas is a key input for the nitrogen fertilizer that much of global agriculture depends on. It shows up in electricity costs in countries that import Gulf liquefied natural gas to run power plants. None of the people paying those higher costs will ever read a CENTCOM press release or a Treasury sanctions announcement, but they are, in a very real sense, the final audience for everything we have just walked through in this video. Every strike, every sanctions designation, and every trade deal announcement is ultimately aimed at getting the actual physical and perceived risk of moving cargo through this 33-kilometer channel back down to a level where insurers, shipping companies, and governments around the world can stop treating it as an emergency. So, if you want to track whether this approach is actually working, rather than waiting for the next dramatic headline, here are the specific indicators that matter more than anything else. Watch shipping data first, not statements. Maritime intelligence firms that track vessel movements in real time will show, within days, whether tanker traffic through the strait is genuinely recovering toward its pre-crisis daily average, or whether shipping companies are still quietly routing around the region or delaying transits despite the public de-escalation signals. Statements from CENTCOM or the Iranian government are position-taking. Actual transit numbers are the closest thing to ground truth available to the public. Watch insurance premiums second. War risk insurance rates for vessels transiting the strait are reassessed constantly by the underwriting market, and those rates respond to perceived risk faster than almost any other indicator. If premiums start coming down meaningfully in the weeks after this strike campaign and the Treasury action, that is the clearest signal available that the market itself believes the underlying threat has actually been reduced, not just paused. Watch for further Treasury designations. Third, beyond the Gulf, major energy importers across Asia, including Japan, South Korea, and India, depend heavily on crude sourced from this region, meaning a serious and sustained closure would ripple through supply chains and cost of living pressures on nearly every continent for people who will never see a headline mentioning the Strait of Hormuz by name. This is why the Treasury action against Iran's sanctions-evasion network and the diplomatic pivot toward Gulf trade deals matter just as much as the strike numbers. A purely military solution to this conflict, more strikes, more targets, repeated indefinitely, does not actually stabilize the economic uncertainty driving up costs for shipping companies and insurers around the world. What stabilizes that uncertainty is a credible signal that the underlying incentive for closing the strait, whether military harassment or financial gain from evading sanctions, is being dismantled at a structural level, alongside reassurance to the economies most exposed that their relationship with Washington will not be sacrificed in the process. There's a useful historical parallel here, and it is one that maritime insurers know well, even if most viewers have never heard of it. During the so-called tanker war of the 1980s, both Iran and Iraq attacked commercial shipping in the Gulf for years without ever fully closing the strait to traffic, because neither side needed to sink every ship attempting the transit. They needed insurers to price the risk high enough that the economics of shipping through the Gulf became painful. That earlier conflict is the direct doctrinal ancestor of the harassment strategy Iran has used throughout this current war, and it is exactly why modern responses to it cannot be purely kinetic. Insurers today rely on real-time risk assessments from maritime intelligence firms that track every incident, every closure announcement, and every diplomatic development in the region, and they adjust premiums accordingly, sometimes within hours of a single incident like the GFS Galaxy attack. A prolonged elevated risk premium on Gulf shipping raises the delivered cost of oil and gas for importers everywhere. Regardless of whether a single additional barrel is physically prevented from moving, that cost shows up in places that have nothing to do with military strategy. It shows up in the price of jet fuel for airlines operating flights that never come anywhere near the Gulf. It shows up in fertilizer prices, since natural gas is a key input for the nitrogen fertilizer that much of global agriculture depends on. It shows up in electricity costs in countries that import Gulf liquefied natural gas to run power plants. None of the people paying those higher costs will ever read a CENTCOM press release or a Treasury sanctions announcement, but they are, in a very real sense, the final audience for everything we have just walked through in this video. Every strike, every sanctions designation, and every trade deal announcement is ultimately aimed at getting the actual physical and perceived risk of moving cargo through this 33-kilometer channel back down to a level where insurers, shipping companies, and governments around the world can stop treating it as an emergency. So, if you want to track whether this approach is actually working, rather than waiting for the next dramatic headline, Here are the specific indicators that matter more than anything else. Watch shipping data first, not statements. Maritime intelligence firms that track vessel movements in real time will show, within days, whether tanker traffic through the strait is genuinely recovering toward its pre-crisis daily average, or whether shipping companies are still quietly routing around the region or delaying transits despite the public de-escalation signals. Statements from CENTCOM or the Iranian government are position-taking. Actual transit numbers are the closest thing to ground truth available to the public. Watch insurance premiums second. War risk insurance rates for vessels transiting the strait are reassessed constantly by the underwriting market, and those rates respond to perceived risk faster than almost any other indicator. If premiums start coming down meaningfully in the weeks after the strike campaign and the Treasury action, that is the clearest signal available that the market itself believes the underlying threat has actually been reduced, not just paused. Watch for further Treasury designations. Third, if the Shamkhani network action is genuinely the opening move in a broader financial campaign rather than an isolated gesture, expect additional sanctions designations targeting other intermediaries, shipping companies, or front entities connected to Iranian oil exports in the coming weeks. A single designation is a data point. A pattern of escalating designations is a strategy. And finally, watch whether the Gulf states follow through publicly on the trade and investment framework the president referenced. Announced intentions to pursue trade deals are cheap. Signed agreements, specific investment figures, and joint statements from Gulf governments are the actual evidence of whether that diplomatic pivot has real substance behind it or was primarily a rhetorical device to accompany the fee reversal. None of these four indicators require insider access or classified information. They are all publicly trackable, and together they will tell you, weeks before the next dramatic headline, whether this multi-domain approach is actually reshaping the underlying incentives in this conflict, or whether we are simply watching another cycle in the same pattern that has repeated itself since February. Before you go, I want two things from you, and I mean both of them directly. First, if this breakdown connected pieces of the story you had not seen connected anywhere else, the strikes, the Treasury action, and the fee reversal as one coordinated sequence rather than three separate news items, share this video with one person who is trying to actually understand this war instead of just watching explosions. Second, tell me what you think in the comments. Do you think degrading Iran's sanctions evasion network will actually change Tehran's calculation on the strait? Or is this simply another temporary lull before the next closure? Is the trade deal pivot toward the Gulf states a sign of genuine strategic patience or a short-term move to keep oil prices down? I read the comments on every one of these videos, and I want your read on this. Here is where things stand. On July 11th, 2026, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps struck the Cyprus-flagged container ship GFS Galaxy in the Strait of Hormuz, then declared the waterway closed until further notice, even as its own diplomats sat down with Omani counterparts to discuss terms for reopening it. Over the following 3 nights, U.S. forces struck more than 300 Iranian targets, missile and drone sites, naval capabilities, ammunition storage, communications networks, and coastal surveillance at the direct order of the president. At the same time, the U.S. Treasury moved against a sanctions-evasion shipping network tied to Mohammad Hossein Shamkhani, described by Treasury Secretary Bessent as one of the regime's most profitable engines. And within days, President Trump reversed a proposed 20% transit fee on Hormuz shipping, replacing it with a stated push for trade and investment deals with Gulf states, while publicly crediting military leadership for the current flow of oil. 3 moves, 1 week. A military campaign to remove Iran's physical ability to threaten the strait. A financial campaign to remove Iran's economic incentive to keep doing it. And a diplomatic pivot to keep every Gulf economy standing near this conflict firmly aligned with Washington rather than looking for their own way out. That is not escalation for its own sake. That is a message aimed at 2 audiences at once, Tehran and the rest of the Gulf, sent in the same 72 hours. And it is exactly why so many people were caught off guard by how the United States actually responded this time. Stay locked in, because whether this approach actually holds the strait open longer than the last one is the question the next chapter of this war is going to answer.